In 1978, the #1 spot on the UK charts was briefly occupied by a patois-talking teenage girl duo of Althea Forrest and Donna Reed talking about Uptown Top Ranking, here on the original Lightning Records UK release, talking in thick Kingston slang about the fashions of the day, and riding a sprightly rhythm. The B-side was credited to the Mighty Two, probably the first many in the UK had ever heard of this credit. Instrumental version on the B-side. The song was actually an answer record to a hit by DJ or rapper Trinity called Three-Piece Suit. Kind of a humorous toast from him. His toast in turn was an answer record to a hit from the Mighty Two production team of Marcia Aitken doing I'm Still in Love with You, which was a straight cover version of an Alton Ellis hit from the late 1960s, which had appeared on Studio One, and all these songs rode the same rhythm track, or basic music track, rhythm in Jamaican parlance. The story of the Mighty Two partnership goes back much further to Joel Gibson being born in 1945 in Montego Bay, Jamaica, qualified in electronics repair through a correspondence course from the US, gravitated to Kingston, where the population and the action was, opened up a TV repair shop called Amalgamated. He was very close to some of the other record shops, which usually the record shops would also have producers. In Jamaica, the producers and the labels are often one and the same. From there, it was easy for him to see the income that was being generated, the activity. He wanted to get into that game as well. In the 1967, he organized his first recording session with music played by the band Lynn Tate and the Jets, very instrumental in the rock steady beat. This was the days of rock steady. To organize the sessions, as Joel Gibson, as he was still called then, did not have much of a musical background himself, he hired Lee Perry, who had just recently left Studio One, where he'd been employed for a few years previous. Some of the first songs Joel Gibson ever came out with were by the Pioneers, Roy Shirley, who hit with Hold Them. Lee Perry issued his own epical I Am the Upsetter, which gave him his enduring nickname. That was kind of a parting shot at his former employer, Cox and Dodd from Studio One. Ironically, when Lee Perry left Joel Gibson, he would fire a similar shot at Joel Gibson's way, called People Funny Boy. Joel Gibson, of course, had to respond with his own version called People Grudgeful, credited to Sir Gibbs. Some have surmised it's Gibbs himself singing on this track. This is a nice compilation which appeared on the Trojan label in the 1980s of early Joel Gibson productions, the Reggae Train, compiled by Steve Barrow. This contains The Upsetter by Lee Perry, as well as hits by the Versatiles, who included a young singer who would eventually come to be known as Junior Biles. Joel Gibson, first man to record him. As well, there are hits by obscure groups like the Reggae Boys, the Immortals, the Slickers, who did go on to become more well-known. There's instrumentals credited to the Joe Gibbs All-Stars. Every producer would have their All-Stars band, often drawn from the same floating pool of musicians. He also did some early solo sides by Peter Tosh of the Wailers, Arise Black Man included on that compilation. Joel Gibson at this time was issuing his music on labels like Pressure Beat. There's another solo shot by Peter Tosh, Maga Dog, on the Pressure Beat label. It's one of the very first used reggae records I ever bought, actually. Found that locally many years ago. As well as labels like Amalgamated after his TV repair shop, Joe Gibbs. He was also instrumental, or he was one of the first to capitalize on the UK as a growing market for reggae, along with producers like Leslie Kong, whose Beverly's shop was very close to Joe Gibbs' shop, as well as Bunny Lee. As early as 1968, Joel Gibson was traveling to the UK to have his productions released on the Trojan label and other labels. He was given another Amalgamated label in the UK to issue his productions through them. Following Lee Perry's time working for Joel Gibson, he employed Winston Niney Holness, very noted producer in his own right, who would be the hands-on man in the studio running sessions, Joel Gibson had his own studio in Dehaney Park in Kingston at this time, a very small studio. In the classic Jamaican fashion, Joel Gibson was not a hands-on producer in the rock sense of the word. The producer is more the guy who runs the label, handles the business end of things, and employs musicians and people to run sessions and organize the actual creative end of the music. Another compilation appeared as Hep Tones and Friends, Volume 2. Not really a Hep Tones solo album, but a various artists compilation. It's on the UK Attack label, and this includes hits by Ken Parker, more Peter Tosh, only 2 tracks by the Hep Tones on here, the great Alton Ellis, and the original cut of Money in My Pocket by a young singer named Dennis Brown, who'd also shortly after or shortly before left Studio One, left Cox and Dodd's employ. That first cut of Money in My Pocket was a hit for Joel Gibson, but would be recut several years later by Dennis Brown and become an even bigger smash. Dennis Brown would have a long and fruitful relationship with Joe Gibbs, but it would take a little time to pay off. In the meantime, in the early 70s, Joel Gibson took a little time off from producing while he expanded to an upgraded 24-track recording studio that he eventually opened at 24 Retirement Crescent in Kingston. By mid-1970s, that was open. In the meantime, he issued one of the very first dub LPs, Dub Serial, which was mixed by Errol Thompson at Randy's studio. Errol Thompson was the chief engineer at Randy's, one of the very first dub LPs to appear on the market. I've handled the dub side of Errol Thompson and some of the dub LPs that he mixed for Joel Gibson in another video. I thought I would expand that into a broader look at the Mighty Two as a whole, hence this video. Getting back to Dennis Brown, once Joel Gibson's studio at 24 Retirement Crescent was open by 1975, he hired Errol Thompson as his chief engineer, hired him away from Randy's studio. Was kind of ultimately a fatal blow to the Randy's studio. They never quite recovered from the loss of Errol Thompson, talented studio engineer, but Joel Gibson, aka Joe Gibbs, as he would soon be known, ran with it, eventually giving Errol Thompson basically co-producer credit, kind of an unheard of arrangement actually in Jamaican music, where the actual producer of the music would often kind of be uncredited, and the name producer, aka the label head, would take all the credit. Joe Gibbs gave equal credit to Errol Thompson, coined the Mighty Two moniker to show that they were equal billing. Even gave Errol Thompson his own sub-label, Errol T. This is further cut of the Money in My Pocket rhythm, Friend and Money. Kind of a hallmark of the Mighty Two productions was its bright, clean sound. Audio engineers even today that are reissuing their music still remark on how well produced that music was. It had kind of a bright, cheery sound. If you're looking for deep roots, maybe the Joe Gibbs Mighty Two productions are not the first choice for you. They do have some. One of the Joe Gibbs Mighty Two labels is Belmont. One of their very earliest releases in 1975 was Silford Walker's Burn Babylon, kind of an obscure singer, but absolute roots burner there. Silford Walker would also have another great tune called Ja Golden Pen. It's a reissue there. Classic Joe Gibbs Record Globe label. One of many. Like many of these producers, their output would be issued on a multitude of labels. Somewhat confusing. Getting back to Dennis Brown, they picked up that partnership begun in the early 70s with that hit Money in My Pocket. Issued an LP called Best of Dennis Brown. Not really a greatest hits compilation, just a further album. You can see how young he is there. The great Dennis Brown has Westbound Train, Playgirl, Smile Like an Angel, cover of The Poorer Side of Town, cover of Silver Words, classic from Dennis Brown on that Joe Gibbs Record Globe label. Always upside down, never fails. The classic, iconic Joe Gibbs Record Globe label. Further works for Dennis Brown would continue through the 1970s. Dennis Brown still only in his late teens, early 20s at the time of all these albums, already a fully formed artist. Some of his work for Joe Gibbs remains some of the absolute most, the pinnacle of the music he released in his career. Further albums through the 1970s included Joseph's Coat of Many Colors, here on the US Joe Gibbs label with the Island and Palm Trees. Includes Slave Driver, Cup of Tea, 3 Meals a Day, Man Next Door, classic upon classic from the man Dennis Brown, the crown prince of reggae, second only to Bob Marley. Words of Wisdom, again, one of his finest albums. Again, on that US Joe Gibbs label. This contained the second cut of Money in My Pocket, released about 7 years after the original cut. Also have the 12-inch version of it handy right here on the iconic Joe Gibbs 12-inch single record globe label. Dennis Brown with Money in My Pocket, the second version. This wrote an updated rockers-style update of the original, included a DJ version by Prince Mohammed and a nice dub version by Errol Thompson on the flip. The tendency of Joe Gibbs and other producers to spin one rhythm track into multiple versions was fully utilized on the advent of the 12-inch single. Once it became common in Jamaica from about the mid-70s on, you would get the vocal version extended into either a dub or a DJ version, all in one seamless mix, and you could have a further version on the B side, either a dub or a DJ version, whichever you didn't get to on the A side. Classic tune from Dennis Brown was a further smash hit for him following that that hit with Althea and Donna in the UK. That was another big hit for Dennis Brown and Joe Gibbs' Mighty 2 partnership with Errol Thompson. Visions of Dennis Brown, maybe his finest album. Again, recorded at Joe Gibbs Recording Studio, 24 Retirement Crescent, a Joe Gibbs production, and that's on the US label. The successes Dennis Brown had with Joe Gibbs led to a record deal with A&M Records, major label deal, led to the Foul Play and The Prophet Rides Again LPs in the early 1980s. Not his finest work, but they have their moments. But certainly a triumph for the Mighty 2 and for Dennis Brown himself, as well as work with singers. The Mighty 2 had hits with many DJs, recorded a lot of DJs, aka the Jamaican rappers. There was an explosion of DJs. One of the most notable they worked with was Prince Far-I. They had a huge hit with the title track Under Heavy Manners, classic from him, on the Joe Gibbs Record Globe label again. Under Heavy Manners referred to the situation in the streets of Kingston as the government imposed something like martial law situation in response to rampant gun violence. Under Heavy Manners, Prince Far-I's commentary on the situation, the rockstone, gruff-voiced DJ. But one of the absolute pinnacles of Joe Gibbs and the Mighty Two's work was 2/7's clash by a harmony trio called Culture, which appeared in 1977. The title referred to a Rastafarian prophecy that of a confrontation between opposing forces that would happen in 1977. It was a prophecy. One of the absolute greatest reggae albums ever recorded. This is actually one of my prized pieces of my collection. Joe Gibbs, Record Globe, sound system copy with sound markings on the label. Classic album, top 10 reggae album for sure. Must have for any collection. 2/7's Clash by Culture. Joe Gibbs and the Mighty 2 would continue working with Culture through a couple more albums. Bald Head Bridge, here on that US label again, as well as releasing his product in the UK, expanded into the US, based out of Florida, I believe. More Culture. This would be the Culture's final work with Joe Gibbs, moving on to Sonia Pottinger, where they recut some of these songs. I've dealt with the dub side of the Mighty Two partnership more fully in that other video. I don't know if that's been uploaded yet as of this date, but suffice to say, following on from Dub Serial, they released the African Dub series, which ran up to 4 volumes, with a 5th one appearing later on in the 1980s. These were hugely popular in the UK, where they crossed over to the UK market. And this is a UK pressing on that Lightning label again. They also issued a instrumental album, Joe Gibbs and the Professionals, State of Emergency. The Professionals was kind of the Joe Gibbs house band. Again, just that floating pool of musicians. Every producer had their own name for them. This would include at various times Sly Dunbar on drums, Robbie Shakespeare or Lloyd Parks on bass. Over at Channel 1, a lot of these same musicians would be credited as the Revolutionaries. Some of us suggested there was a political divide between Joe Gibbs and his main rival Channel 1 studios at this time, the Professionals, maybe reflecting Joe Gibbs's conservative tendencies, whereas Channel 1 going more for the left-wing revolutionary vibe with the Revolutionaries and some of their militant sleeve designs at the time. Many of Joe Gibbs's work with DJs appeared on his own compilations, Original DJ Classics. Just collects a lot of these tracks. These are all available either through Joe Gibbs or through VP. There's 12-inch single compilations, ran to a whole series, Volume 2. Very nice compilation of Joe Gibbs and the Mighty Two productions appeared from the Heartbeat label in 1992. The Mighty Two. In the early 2000s, Soul Jazz Records put out Joe Gibbs Productions. Again, a very nice compilation. As well as putting out a collection, Pressure Sounds put out a collection of dubs, No Bones for the Dogs, showcasing the mixing style of Errol Thompson, which particularly as the 70s went on would include a lot of funny sound effects, ringing doorbells, flushing toilets. He would throw all these things in the mix. Further on, they had many hits with DJs, kind of, as I said, kind of a brighter, cleaner sound, particularly anticipating the dancehall sound that would get stronger in the early 80s. A lot of work with DJs who became very popular in the 80s. Joe Gibbs kind of anticipated that, and definitely with an eye on the charts, definitely a cleaner, more commercial sound. In the early 80s, he had another huge smash hit with a song called Somebody Loves You Honey by a singer called June Lodge, later known as J.C. Lodge. It was a cover of a Charlie Pride song. Unfortunately, it was an unauthorized cover version. Joe Gibbs got in some hot water over that. Eventually, this business reversal caused him to shut down his music production for several years. Joe Gibbs unfortunately retired from the music industry, converted his record store into a grocery store, which Errol Thompson then managed for him before they, to some extent, reemerged into music many years later. But that was it for the Mighty Two partnership, which for a time in the second half of the 1970s was in the upper echelon of reggae producers, probably Channel 1, their only rivals at that time. But that has been my look at Joe Gibbs and the Mighty Two. Also in 2002, a tribute album appeared by Steely and Clevie, redoing many of the Joe Gibbs and the Mighty Two classics, called Old to the New. This is a mix of original artists and new artists redoing the songs in an updated style. Many of these songs got a lot of radio play in the reggae world at the time. Very nice updated versions, but main focus of the Mighty Two was in those mid to late 70s productions. Classic Joe Gibbs 12-inch disco sleeve. There's many, many labels, many variations. Joe Gibbs 12-inch Super Groover. I got a whole stack of these 12 inches. I'll just show you very quickly. Big stack like that. All Joe Gibbs 12 inches. Not even a fraction of all the music they issued in those brief, short years. Unfortunately, in 2004, Errol Thompson passed away after a series of strokes. He had just started getting back into music again in the 1990s, had just mixed a rhythm track for Joe Gibbs's son, Stephen Gibbo Gibson, called Hard Times, which was released in 2004, 2005-ish. That was his very final job. And Joe Gibbs himself would pass away in 2008 after a heart attack, bringing a final end to the Mighty Two partnership, but certainly a classic legacy of music. That has been my luck at Joe Gibbs. Hope you enjoyed, guys. Cheers.